Russia makes a secret landing in the Arctic near Greenland. Within moments, the US military reacts so quickly and so precisely that Moscow is left stunned. At exactly 3:14 local time, deep inside the freezing fog over the Lincoln Sea, the still Arctic surface suddenly cracks open. A huge Russian Yasen-M submarine rises through the ice just 45 meters from the coast of Greenland. Its launch systems are active, its presence unmistakable, and its message aimed straight at the heart of the Atlantic. Along the frozen shoreline, elite Russian special forces rush in from rigid hull boats. Their boots hit sovereign ground as they move to raise a flag, convinced the world is too distracted to notice. In their minds, they are ghosts slipping through a blind spot in America's vision, while Washington is focused elsewhere in Greenland. But as the Russian commander prepares to report success back to Moscow, he has no idea that the air around him is already alive with an unseen American electronic shield. Beneath the ice and high above in silent layers of the atmosphere, something is already in motion. Something Kremlin sensors have not detected. Stay with us to the very end, because the way this covert landing unravels includes a calculated, invisible response and a chain of Russian losses that Moscow still cannot clearly explain to its own public. And in the final moments, we reveal the real cost Russia paid for this miscalculation. The global balance had already shifted sharply in the tense weeks after a decisive US operation removed a growing threat in Venezuela. That move sent a clear signal through the Kremlin. Washington was once again fully committed to securing the GIUK gap, the critical naval corridor between Greenland, Iceland, and the United Kingdom. There was even growing discussion about the long-term strategic value of a permanent military presence in Greenland to strengthen NATO's northern flank. For Moscow, that meant one thing: its leverage in the high north was fading fast. This was never just another patrol. It was a bold covert landing designed to create a fait accompli on the ground, a lasting Russian foothold on Greenlandic territory that could trigger a diplomatic crisis with Moscow holding the advantage. More than anything, Russia wanted to prove that it could still project power into the center of the Atlantic and force the world to pay attention. What the Kremlin failed to understand was simple. The US Navy and the Air Force do not merely operate in the Arctic, shaped by decades of Cold War experience. They have mastered the environment itself. The Russian force, led by Admiral Kasatonov, was acting under a doctrine of so-called active defense, Moscow's preferred label for pushing territorial control under the cover of security. They deployed some of their most capable units. The 45th Separate Special Purpose Brigade of the VDV, along with Northern Fleet teams trained for sub-zero covert action and rapid airfield capture. Their entire mindset was built on a dangerous assumption that the United States would react too slowly or too cautiously to stop a gray zone operation that fell short of an open declaration of war. To support the landing, they relied on the Krasnoyarsk, one of the quietest nuclear-powered cruise missile submarines in the Russian arsenal. Moscow believed it could serve as an invisible shield beneath the ice, with sonar advanced enough to spot any American approach long before it became a real concern. The plan was bold: land, fortify, and build out a long-range S-400 missile perimeter before announcing their presence to the world. In one move, they hoped to create a new Cold War reality overnight. Russian planners were counting on Washington being stretched thin by commitments in South America and the Middle East. It was a gamble on a historic scale, built on an outdated belief that Arctic storms could still blind American surveillance and that the sheer distance from the continental United States would slow any meaningful response. They expected days of diplomatic confusion and delay. They did not expect a crushing answer within the first hour. At the same time, the Russian command structure was weighed down by a deep sense of overconfidence. They trusted that their Polyak electronic warfare systems could hide their signature from Western detection. They moved with the certainty of a force that had not faced an equal technological opponent in decades. The Russian Ministry of Defense assumed that because the United States was busy deploying new systems in the Caribbean, the GIUK gap would be left lightly watched. What they failed to grasp was this: the US Navy does not simply step away from a theater. It turns that theater into a machine. Along the seabed, sonar arrays tied into the upgraded SOSUS network had already picked up the acoustic trace of the Krasnoyarsk. Quietly, almost invisibly, that signature was passed across the Atlantic and into the hands of analysts in Virginia. Every vibration from that 7-bladed propeller was being captured, processed, and turned into a tactical advantage. The danger was no longer simply serious. For the Russian force on the ground, it was becoming impossible to manage. Moscow's objective was to create a buffer zone, but the entire plan rested on a critical misreading of American speed, coordination, and battlefield awareness. The Russians believed they were stepping into position with the advantage. In reality, they were moving straight into a trap already built around them, and the Americans were not arriving late. They were already in place, waiting with the kind of overwhelming technological edge that defines modern U.S. military doctrine. The response was led by the USS Gerald R. Ford Carrier Strike Group, which had been holding position in the North Atlantic under strict emissions control. To Russian electronic surveillance, the 100,000-ton supercarrier was practically invisible. At the center of the U.S. counter-operation was the Aegis combat system aboard Arleigh Burke-class destroyers, especially the USS Donald Cook. Using its AN/SPY-6 radar, it could track Russian warships even through dense Arctic fog and blowing snow. The system was so sensitive that detecting large surface combatants in those conditions was never really in doubt. While Russian crews were dealing with ice buildup and the limitations of older sensor systems, the U.S. Navy was already deploying P-8A Poseidon aircraft to scatter a smart field of multi-static sonobuoys around the Russian Yasen-class submarine. Each buoy became part of a wider digital web, turning the undersea battlespace from a place of concealment into something the Americans could read with stunning clarity. The United States was not simply preparing to intercept, it was preparing to make a statement. A flight of F-35C Lightning II aircraft was sent forward, bringing with it one of the most advanced sensor and networking capabilities ever placed in combat aviation. Through their multifunction advanced data link, the jets coordinated a simulated strike package so seamless that Russian operators would likely have had almost no warning before the situation was already beyond recovery. Each F-35C functioned like a battlefield commander in the sky, merging information from satellites, subsurface sensors, and surface assets into one unified tactical picture. This was not a balanced contest. It was a multi-domain trap in which nearly every Russian move could be answered almost immediately, often before their commanders had fully understood what was unfolding. On the American side, the preparation was total. The USS Donald Cook was only one piece of a much larger force. Behind it stood the full striking power of the Gerald R. Ford's Air Wing, including EA-18G Growlers configured to disrupt the frequencies associated with Russian air defense systems. The Navy also had access to Tomahawk Block 5 missiles, weapons built for flexibility and capable of adjusting in flight as the tactical picture changed. Inside the combat information centers, there was no confusion and no panic. Every operator was highly trained, every movement deliberate, every decision measured. They were not reacting emotionally. They were executing a plan with the calm precision of people who had prepared for this moment long before it arrived. They were operating under what the Americans called an Arctic-denied protocol, fully pre-modeled, stress-tested, and rehearsed countless times inside high-fidelity digital twins of every major platform involved. In contrast, the Russian force was effectively relying on an operational mindset rooted decades in the past, while the United States was executing doctrine shaped by next-generation systems, integration, and real-time battlefield networking. The speed of American coordination meant that from the moment the first Russian unit made contact with Greenlandic terrain, a complete response architecture was already in place. At 0352 hours, the situation reached its turning point. It did not begin with an explosion or a dramatic warning. Instead, it unfolded as a sudden and overwhelming display of control over the battle space, one that immediately disrupted Russian operational confidence. As Russian special forces prepared to raise their flag on elevated terrain near the landing zone, the night sky shifted violently. Light broke through the Arctic darkness as if daylight had arrived in an instant. Two U.S. Air Force B-21 Raiders, operating in their first real high-intensity mission scenario, released long-range anti-ship munitions. The missiles were not intended for direct impact. Instead, they were programmed for extreme low-altitude, high-speed flybys, passing just above the masts of Russian vessels at hypersonic velocity. The resulting pressure waves shook the area, disrupting systems, rattling structures, and forcing crews to break formation and seek cover. At the same time, the USS Donald Cook executed a rapid engagement profile. Its 5-inch Mark 45 naval gun system tracked with automated precision, while its Sea Wasp Block 3 electronic warfare suite saturated Russian communications with layered interference, effectively breaking coordination across multiple channels. Russian command teams suddenly found their displays corrupted with false returns and their encrypted networks overwhelmed. Then came a calm, controlled transmission from the U.S. command network. Russian vessels, you are operating in violation of sovereign air and maritime space. You have 300 seconds to alter course and withdraw. Failure to comply will result in engagement. Inside the Russian combat information centers, the realization set in that they were being tracked simultaneously by multiple systems they could not visually confirm. The sense of control had shifted entirely. Below the surface, the Yasen M submarine attempting to reposition was abruptly exposed. A Virginia-class submarine, the USS Vermont, had been shadowing it at close range for hours without detection. A powerful active sonar pulse confirmed its position instantly, eliminating any remaining ambiguity about the underwater battle space. For the Russian commander aboard, the situation had shifted from operational risk to complete tactical isolation. Systems were degraded, options were shrinking, and every passing second represented increasing exposure to coordinated multi-domain pressure. On the surface, Russian special forces, watching the overhead B-21 activity, understood the same reality in real time. They were no longer operating within a contested zone. They were inside a fully controlled environment. What followed was not chaos, but a tightly managed de-escalation sequence executed with procedural discipline. And behind closed doors in Moscow, the implications of what had just unfolded began to register with increasing concern, seeing that every element of their operational chain had been systematically disrupted and that even their most concealed submarine was now fully exposed. The Russian High Command issued an urgent encrypted order, full withdrawal. What followed was a rapid and disorganized retreat. The special forces units that had arrived with confidence scrambled back toward their landing craft, abandoning equipment in the process. Cold weather gear, ammunition containers, and even specialized drone control systems were left behind as the urgency of escape overtook procedure. As the withdrawal unfolded, Russian surface vessels attempted a final defensive missile launch to cover the retreat and regain some control of the narrative. Neither launch achieved its intended effect. One missile failed shortly after ignition, likely due to severe environmental stress and technical malfunction. The other was disrupted mid-flight by advanced electronic countermeasures, causing it to veer off course and fall harmlessly into the frozen sea. These incidents were never officially detailed in full by Moscow, adding to the ambiguity surrounding the operation and its outcome. Meanwhile, Russian forces continued their retreat toward the Kola Peninsula, tracked at every stage by persistent underwater and aerial surveillance. American sonar contact remained steady until the last units crossed back into their own territorial waters. In the days that followed, satellite observations suggested a subdued atmosphere around Northern Fleet command facilities. What had been intended as a bold forward move had instead turned into a costly lesson in exposure, speed, and coordination. From the American side, there was no celebration, no public display of triumph. The response remained measured and procedural, an operation completed exactly as planned, with all objectives achieved and no deviation from protocol. The Arctic returned to its silence, the ice closing over once again as if nothing had happened. But beneath that silence, the message was clear. Attempts to reshape the region through rapid, covert deployments had been met with a level of awareness and readiness that left no room for ambiguity. The balance in the high north had shifted, and it was now defined by constant surveillance, rapid response capability, and an unmistakable American presence that remained long after the moment had passed. This encounter stands as a cold reminder of a broader truth about modern conflict in the 2020s. Strength is no longer defined simply by fleet size or messaging power, but by the speed of information flow, the quality of integration, and the discipline of the people operating the systems. Russia tried to apply a 20th century approach, territorial pressure, rapid presence, and assumption of delayed reaction. In a world shaped by continuous surveillance, networked sensing, and near-instant coordination across domains. What they discovered is that the Arctic is not an unmonitored frontier where actions go unnoticed. It is a fully observed and actively managed environment where timing, awareness, and precision matter more than raw intent. The American response was not accidental or improvised. It reflected long-term investment, layered planning, and years of training designed specifically for fast escalation scenarios in extreme environments. In that framework, hesitation is minimized and response cycles are compressed. As global tensions continue to evolve and different powers test boundaries in remote regions, one consistent reality remains. Stability is maintained not only through diplomacy, but through visible readiness and the ability to act decisively under pressure. The outcome of this episode sends a clear strategic message. Attempts to establish control through rapid, covert moves in highly monitored environments are increasingly unlikely to succeed without immediate detection and response. In today's world, restraint is often mistaken for absence. But the difference becomes obvious the moment a line is crossed, and the reaction begins almost immediately.